So I'm sure you've seen the Save Our NHS campaign. What are your views though on privatisation within the NHS?
So it has received a lot of media coverage over the past few months, but privatisation within the NHS is not a new thing. I think it actually started under the Blair and Brown Labour governments. But what the coalition government have come in and done with the Health and Social Care Act is they've extended a more market-based approach to the NHS market, so making it more accessible to these for-profit companies. And I think it's this issue that people refer to as privatisation within the NHS. So asking private sector companies to come in and run NHS services. So simply put, the government believes that increasing competition will drive an improvement in the quality of care. But on the other hand, some people believe if there was no competition, it would actually save money for the NHS in the long run. So it's a big conflict of opinion. One example of this so-called outsourcing to private companies is Hinchingbrook Hospital, which was franchised to a private sector operator, Circle. But January just gone, so in January 2015, Circle actually handed management of Hinchingbrook back to the NHS after a CQC report led to the hospital being put into special measures, which wasn't good. But it isn't all bad. They did show some improvements, in particularly across diagnosis of almost all conditions. But to complicate matters further, some people believe that Circle wasn't actually given a fair shot at doing its job, and the figures do actually reflect this. So in the year before withdrawing, Circle's budget from the NHS was actually cut by 10%, compared to just 3% cuts faced by the other two local hospitals in the same area. Circle left Hinchingbrook with a deficit of about £10 million, which the media picked up on as something really, really negative. But this was compared to a deficit of 30 million that we would be facing if the hospital had stayed in the hands of the public sector. So overall, I believe who provides a service is less important than the quality of care that they provide. And whether a company makes a profit from its trading with the NHS doesn't automatically mean that the quality of care they provide is compromised. So this is a really common question that you could be faced with if the interviewer decides to go down the route of asking you about the NHS. The interviewer may give you a clue as to what they're thinking down the lines of by mentioning the Save Our NHS campaigns, but they're totally entitled to simply phrase the question as, what are your thoughts on privatisation within the NHS? The key word there being within. Most students fall into the trap of defining private healthcare, defining the NHS and comparing between the two, but that's not what the question is asking for. It specifically says privatisation within the NHS. So what they're basically asking for is to talk about outsourcing, so giving contracts to the private sector to run NHS services. So once we've seen the trap, now look more closely at the question again. What are your thoughts on privatisation within the NHS? So this is another opinion question. So we want to stick to the Easy Medical Interviews opinion framework. Define it, give the pros, give the cons, and then wrap up your answer with your conclusion. So let's now break down the answer that we gave. Start off by defining what privatisation within the NHS is. And the two buzzwords you want to try and remember are market-based approach and outsourcing, to really clearly show your interviewer that you really understand what the term means. So we then went on to touch on why the government has a big view on privatisation within the NHS, and the main reason here is they believe increased competition will drive improvement in the quality of care. Whereas on the other hand, some people believe that if there was no competition, it would cut costs for the NHS in the long term. Once you've defined privatisation within the NHS, now make sure you bring in your case study. And the big one to remember here is Hinchingbrook, which was franchised to a private sector operator, Circle. We started with the cons here, and the main one you want to remember is the CQC report that led to Hinchingbrook being placed under special measures and therefore led to Circle pulling out of the project. Once you've done that, then move on to the positives, and the one that we've used is improvements in diagnostic rates. Normally, once you've done the pros and the cons, you then wrap up your answer with your conclusion. But with Hinchingbrook, things are slightly more complicated. So to really stand out, what you can try and throw in is how politics got involved and affected the funding. So there's two main statistics, if you can remember them, which would be great. The first one is that the year before withdrawing, Circle's budget was cut by 10% compared to 3% cuts that were faced by the other two local hospitals. And the other statistic is that Circle left Hinchingbrook with a deficit of £10 million, which would be compared to the £30 million deficit we would be facing if Hinchingbrook had remained in public sector hands. Once you've done that, wrap your answer up with your conclusion. And we've stayed in the safe zone by saying who delivers the care is less important than the quality of care that they provide.